Job chapter 39. What we have in Job 38 and 39 is we have God speaking. God is speaking to Job from a whirlwind. And you watch that footage of tornadoes and stuff, it's got to remind you of what you find here in Job. God speaking from a funnel cloud, a tornado, a whirlwind, speaking, manifesting His power to Job. And asking Job a series of questions. Now you remember what Job had said. Job was suffering indescribably. Lost everything. Lost his health, his wealth, his children. And he wanted an audience with God. He wanted to talk to God. He wanted to lay his case before God. He wanted answers from God. Well, God appeared to him in a whirlwind and started questioning Job. And God was wanting answers from Job. Asking him, where were you when I created everything? Where were you when I did this? Do you know about this? Are you able to do these things? And he asked him all these questions about nature and how nature works. And Job has no answers to these things, as we're going to see as we get into chapter 40. So we see here that God is continuing to question Job. And he's asking him about nature. And it's very interesting that all the human philosophies that were going on as far as why is Job going through this? Why is this happening to Job? Job, what did you do? You must have really sinned for this to happen. He calls this darkening of counsel by words without knowledge. Job chapter 38 and verse 2. These are people, basically God is saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You have words without knowledge. He says in verse 3 of Job 38, you prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. And here now, God is asking the questions and wanting Job to answer. Chapter 39 and verse 1, as God is continuing to ask these questions. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young? They bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. Their young ones are healthy. They grow strong with a grain. They depart and do not return to them. He's asking them there about the mountain goats bearing their young, the deer giving birth. You know, man, even now with our sophisticated technology, you know, we might be able to track a few of them here and there with monitoring devices and go and try to find them, put a beacon on them and locate them. But we don't know. All that goes on in nature without man there. It happens by the laws of nature that God put into place. And the concept of the deer and the mountain goat, these animals giving birth and reproducing after their kind. God created them to do so. In Genesis chapter 1, you reproduce after your kind. And they are doing this, and they've been doing this ever since the creation. And as he said in chapter 38, the rain falls in the desert and gives nutrients and water for the plants there, and there's no man there. There's no man in the wilderness. So nature is being taken care of by God. This is God's way of providentially taking care of the natural realm. And he's asking, do you know about these things? You know about what takes place. Even when we do have domesticated animals, we just pin them up and let nature take their course. That's basically what we do. So there is a sophistication there in the natural realm that only God could have put into motion. And it is taking place, and he's asking Job, Job, do you know all about this? Verses 5 through 8, he asks him about the wild donkey. Job chapter 39 and verse 5, who set the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the onage? An onage is a species of wild donkey. Whose home I have made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling. He scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountain is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. And he's talking about this wildlife here, that man isn't out feeding the mountain goats. They're being taken care of. Man is not out taking care of the deer. God's taking care of them. And here you have the wild donkey, the onage, as it is called here there in verse 5. This animal is made in the wilderness, to be in the wilderness. The barren land is for his dwelling. It's very interesting when you take long trips and you go out and you get out of the city and you see these animals. They're out there, and it's just nature going after its own processes. And we are just here as a part of that. We have dominion over the world. Of course, God gave that to man in Genesis chapter 1. But nature is going along by the laws which God created. And he says, do you know about this? Or who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of this creature? I have made the wilderness for this creature, the barren lands for the dwelling. Whose home have I made for that? So you have God preparing these animals for their dwelling place. And there's a very interesting thing that you can look into and see how that God placed within the animals the ability to adapt to their surroundings. The ability to, whatever environment or climate they find themselves in, they have the ability to survive there. And so they can survive. You can have polar bears that live in the polar region. And you can have grizzly bears in some of the cold regions, but not as cold as the polar. You can have black bears in warmer climates. They have the ability to adapt to their surroundings. That's not evolution. That's God designed them to have that ability to adapt. And therefore, you see God providing for nature. Look at verses 9 through 12. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? Or will he plow the valleys behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? The wild ox that he's talking about here is, some believe, referring to a species of wild ox, not the domesticated kind of cattle, but a wild ox that existed then that was very strong, and it could not be domesticated. It was a strong animal. And that Hebrew word is denoting that in the original language. So he's saying, can you domesticate this animal? Can you do this? Well, there's certain animals that by and large you cannot domesticate. You might have a certain animal that is wild that you might tame to a certain degree, but they're still a wild animal. And that's basically what he's saying. There are certain animals that cannot be domesticated, and this wild ox is not going to be willing to serve you. So he's telling Job basically this: you have limitations. There's things you don't know. There's things you don't understand. I made them. I created them. I put this all in motion. And I'm able to take care of the natural realm. And if I'm able to do that, I can take care of you. And that's the message that he's trying to get across to Job. Any questions or comments before we go any further? Verses 13 through 18, he's going to talk about the ostrich. Very interesting bird, flightless bird. But it has wings. He says in verse 13, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or the wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts up herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. Very interesting what he's saying here about the ostrich. And he's talking about the wings of an ostrich. Wave proudly. Have you ever seen footage of an ostrich male doing the mating ritual dance? They wave their wings back and forth. Their wings are there for a purpose. And some, of course, evolution says, well, they lost the ability of flight millions of years ago, and those wings are just leftovers from their ancestors. No, those wings have a purpose. They're not vestigial organs, as the scientists want to call them. Those wings are used to display. The male uses them. And when the ostrich runs, he uses those wings for balance. He's got to have those wings to balance. And if you ever watch footage of ostrich run, they can turn on a dime. Those little wings that they have are used for balancing. So God is so great, He created birds to fly, birds to run, and some birds to swim. Penguins. He created those birds with the ability to fly or swim underwater. So He created all of these different kinds of creatures. And He says this bird is a bird that seems it's devoid of understanding. You've ever heard of the expression bird brain? Ostrich sometimes can be, from our vantage point, a harsh parent, so to speak. Leaves her eggs on the ground. They nest on the ground. Warms them in the dust. Make sure there's a proper temperature. That's very important. It's very important with animals that nest on the ground to have their eggs at a certain temperature, or the development of the embryo cannot take place properly. Alligators, crocodiles, other nesting animals that nest on the ground are very concerned about the temperature of their nest, because it has to be an optimal, certain temperature for those embryos to develop within the egg. Again, God taught them that. Verse 15, she forgets that a foot may crush them, or the wild beast may break them. So they're on the ground, they're vulnerable. She treats her young harshly as though they're not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern. Why is that? Verse 7, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. Ostrich is not the animal in the animal kingdom. That's what he's saying. But God says, I can make something like this. I could create something like this. But it is a swift runner. Verse 18. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. Ostriches can get up to very high speeds in running. There's even been ostrich races. You might have seen them on TV or on videos. And so these birds can run very fast. They're not created to fly. They're created as ground-dwelling birds. And these birds are different in their care for their young than some others would be. But he's showing Job that these creatures are creatures that he created, the variety of creatures he created. I mean, he's talked in this chapter about the mountain goats, the deer, the wild donkey, the wild oxen, the ostrich. And he said, I'm taking care of all these animals, even the ones that are not the smartest ones I made. I'm taking care of all of them. And if I can take care of an ostrich, I can take care of you. I believe that's the message he's trying to get across to Job. But then he talks about the horse, the majestic horse. Verse 19. Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, and the glittering spear and javelin. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. At the blast of the trumpet, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting. Talking about the horse. Can you create something like this, Job? Verse 19. Those who've worked with horses, you know the majesty and the power of these animals. And he says, did you give them their strength? They're very powerful creatures. And you can just see the design in them. How God designed their legs, their hooves, their muscle system, their skeletal system. He says, I have made this creature, this horse, clothe the neck with thunder. He says there in verse 19. And this is a majestic creature that you can use to go into battle with. Horses can be trained to go into military situations. And that's what he's talking about in these verses. How majestic the horse is, even when it goes into battle. He does not halt because the trumpet has sounded, there in verse 24. He devours the distance with fierce rage. I mean, he can gallop towards the distance with fierceness of rage. And he is a trainable animal here in verse 25. At the blast of the trumpet, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and shouting. So he talks about an animal that's not too bright, the ostrich, and now he's talking about a pretty intelligent animal. The horse. A horse that can be trained and can be used in battle situations that you can rely upon. And so you see he's putting on display these animals, saying, look at what I made. Can you do something like that? Verse 26 through 30. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and the stronghold. From there it spies out its prey, its eyes observe from afar. Its young ones suck up blood where the slain are, there it is. Now he's going to talk about the birds here, talk about the hawk, talk about the eagles, these birds of prey in Job 39 and verse 26. And he says, does the hawk fly by your wisdom? In other words, did you design this creature to fly, Job? Is it by your wisdom that you came up with a bird, a hawk? In doing some research on this, I came across the fact that the hawk is one of the swiftest, along with the eagle, but some of the hawks are some of the swiftest birds that there are. And it engages in various types of flight patterns. So it is a perfect example of flight. In fact, where does man get his concept of flying? From the birds. Man studied birds to learn how to fly. We would not have airplanes today if it were not for birds. We're mimicking what God created when we have airplanes. And so you look at that and you can see that there had to be a design there. The way the bird is designed to go through the air, and you just study the biology of a bird, their bone structure, their lightweight design of them. They are made for precision flight. And not only that, he talks about They spy their prey from afar. Telescoping lenses within birds of prey. The concept of being a hawkeye. The concept of seeing something from afar, zeroing in on something. Eagles and hawks have that ability. They can spot prey from miles away. I don't even know how many miles, but you could look up and see how many miles. They could see a small animal, small rodent in the grass. And again, what do we get our lenses from? What God created. The concept of a lens, the concept of a camera, that comes from studying the eyes. Telescoping lens comes from studying the creatures like this. We got the concept of cameras and things like that from studying what God created in the eye. Charles Darwin was the father of evolution. And he wrote the book Origin of the Species. And he said, when I try to think about how the eye evolved, it leaves me cold. Well, there's no way you can evolve an eye. There's no way blind chance, natural happenings can create something. Blind chance and just accidental forces coming together don't design. We saw yesterday what destruction happens as a result of chaos. You have to have an intelligence putting things together for them to function. When those tornadoes went through this area, did the smoke clear? And there's a perfectly built house. That's what the evolutionists basically want us to believe when it comes to this universe. That somehow accidentally, billions of years ago, there was an explosion, and now here you are. You're a product of an accident. Accidents don't create complexity. They don't create building structures. They create chaos. You have to have an intelligence to make something. And that's exactly what God is saying. I made these birds. From the dumb bird of the ostrich to these birds of prey. These raptors, the hawk, the eagle. I made those. They're perfect examples of flight. And they live up in high places. And from there they can spot their prey. God is putting on display His exhibits of creation. Said, I did all these. Job, does the hawk fly by your wisdom? Well, no, we're not smart enough to make anything like that. We have to look at the birds to be able to learn how to fly. You know, some of the earliest designs of flight and the concept of flying was Leonardo da Vinci. You ever seen some of his drawings? You know what they're based upon? The bat's wing and the bird's wing. He was trying to make flying machines back in the time that he lived. And he was basing those designs on what's in creation. You can't improve upon it. So most of what we have as technology today is based upon what God has already made. He's already made it. Any questions or comments before we go into chapter 40? Look at chapter 40 and verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. He's saying, you wanted to contend with me. You wanted an audience with me. Now I want you, who wanted to correct me, to answer these things. Verse 3, Job answered and said to him, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say. I mean, what can you say? Even in the 21st century with all our technology, most of these questions we can't answer. What can you say? God's saying, He's scolding Job. He's scolding him. So you wanted to contend with me. You wanted to correct me. You thought I was unjust for what was happening to you. I've got these questions here, and I want you to answer them. Job said, I'm vile. I'm vile. Vile is the concept there of being unclean. It's very interesting when people were faced with God in the Old Testament, when He would appear to them, they recognized their unworthiness to be in His presence. What happened when God appeared to Moses from the burning bush? He hid his face. He didn't want to look upon God. God said, take the sandals off your feet. The place you stand is holy ground. He was afraid to look upon God. What happened when God appeared to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6? And he saw the throne room of God in that vision, and the seraphim flying around, worshiping God, saying, holy, holy, holy. He says, woe, Isaiah said, woe is me, I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. He recognized his unworthiness and his sinfulness to be in the presence of God. You remember when Jesus performed that miracle with the fish with Peter? And Peter came to realize this is somebody special. Peter said, depart from me, I'm a sinful man. That's what he said to Christ. And Jesus said, I will from henceforth make you fisher of men. Peter realized he was unworthy. In the gospel accounts, when a demon would come across Jesus, I know who you are, the demon says. You're the Holy One of Israel. And they were terrified of him. They were scared to death of him. The unworthiness. And this is what Job is feeling here. I'm not worthy. I'm vile. I don't have anything to say. Look at verse 6. Job 40 and verse 6. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Still, the whirlwind's twirling. And God's voice is speaking from this whirlwind to Job. Now prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. That's what he said to him in chapter 38. You get yourself ready, you prepare yourself like a man, and I'm going to question you, and you answer me. Verse 8, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that I may be justified? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Or can you thunder with a voice like His? Are you going to put me on trial? You going to put me on trial? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? I've come across people who said that they have a lot of things they're planning on saying to God on the day of judgment. I don't think so. Not when they stand before the Almighty. They're going to change their tune. I hope they change their tune before they get to that point. But that's the attitude. You're going to put me on trial, God is saying. Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like His? An arm represents strength, the ability to do something. Do you have the strength of God, Job? Can you thunder with a voice like His? Verse 10. Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and array yourself with glory and beauty. Job, can you do that? No, only God can do that. Only the majesty of God can do such a thing. Adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and array yourself with glory and beauty. Verse 11. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Verse 12. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Are you able to do these things? Can you humble people like I can? Can you tread down the wicked in their place? Verse 13, hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. If you can do these things, then you can save yourself. If you're able to do these things, then your own right hand can save you. Well, no one can do that. No human on earth can do what he's saying here. But that's what he's saying. If you have my power and my ability and my majesty, and if you're willing to humble the wicked, if you can do these things, then you can be your own Savior. Of course, that can't happen. Now, verses 15 through 24 is very interesting. And also chapter 40, beginning in verse 1, is going to talk about two creatures. One is called the behemoth, or behemoth, depending on how you pronounce that. I say behemoth. And in chapter 41, he's going to talk about a leviathan. Now, as we look at this creature, we're going to see that this is not any creature that's alive today. Neither one of these creatures. And I believe it is important for us to understand what type of creature this most likely is to be able to answer some of those who ask the question, if God created everything, does that include the dinosaurs? We need to be able to answer this question. We know God created everything. Everything that existed as far as life forms on earth, God created up to the sixth day, and then that includes man being the ultimate of the creation, and then he rested on the seventh. So if dinosaurs, these gigantic creatures, did exist, they were created on day 5 and 6 of the creation week. And those were literal 24-hour days. So the question is, did man and dinosaur coexist? And the answer the Bible gives, when you look at it very carefully, is yes. Man and dinosaurs did coexist. Well, then the next question is, well, then where are they mentioned in the Bible? I believe right here. Job 38, beginning in verse 15, talks about the behemoth, and in chapter 41 and verse 1 talks about the leviathan. These are creatures that are unlike any other creatures that we find alive today. And we read the description of them, we're going to see that. The word behemoth means a gigantic creature in Hebrew. It means a gigantic, it doesn't identify it, it just means it's a big creature. It's a big creature. So some scholars have tried to say, well, this is a hippopotamus or perhaps an elephant. They're big creatures. But notice the description of it as we go through. Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies down under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth. Though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. Or one pierces his nose with a snare. So you have this behemoth creature. Notice it is a plant-eating creature. He eats grass like an oxen. We know from what we are told, that a lot of the dinosaurs were herbivores. They ate grass, plant-eating animals. His strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. So this is a powerful creature. He moves his tail like a cedar. Now, think about a creature that has a tail like a cedar tree. It's not an elephant. It's not a hippopotamus. But it has a tail like a cedar. The only thing that fits that description that ever lived in the past of Earth is what we call dinosaur. Now, we have to understand the word dinosaur is a very new word. It was not till the early 1800s that we came up with the word dinosaur, and it means terrible lizard. So here you have a creature that fits the description of what we would call a dinosaur, a plant-eating dinosaur. He moves his tail like a cedar. Well, this creature's tail is huge. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. The bones are like beams of bronze, and his ribs like bars of iron. They're so big, they're like bars. They're like beams of bronze. We find the skeletal remains of these creatures, and they've got huge bones, huge fossilized remains. Again, it fits the description. Verse 19, he is the first or the chief of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. This creature is so big, so humongous, that he is the chief, the foremost of the creatures of God. The biggest land-dwelling animals that ever walked the face of the earth were dinosaurs. The kind that had the long neck and the long tail, and they ate grass, ate vegetation. No human could bring this creature down. Only he who made him, that would be God, can bring near his sword. This is a humongous creature that only God could bring near the sword. He's the chief of the ways of God. He's putting him on display as you look at this creature. I made this. I made this. He said, I made you too, Job. In verse 15. So this creature is humongous. Again, it talks about its dwelling there in verse 20. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies down under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marshes. Some of them would dwell in marsh field areas. Lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows of the brook surround him. And look at verse 23. This creature is so big, he's not disturbed when the rivers run over their banks. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. Now, you get a big enough flood going on, some creatures would be disturbed, like the hippopotamus or the elephant. But this creature's big enough that if the water rages, it's not going to bother him at all. So you see, this creature is something that is set forth as being on display as God's exhibit A of what he has made. He is the first, back to verse 19, he is the first of the ways of God, the chief of the ways of God. Now this animal that he's describing here, the biggest land-dwelling animal that ever walked the face of the earth, would be these dinosaurs. And it would certainly fit the bill of being the chief or the first of the ways of God. So then the next question is, well, then what happened to them? We don't believe the evolutionary theory that says they lived 65 million years ago and an asteroid hit the planet or a comet and wiped out life, and then that gave an opportunity for the small mammals to evolve into all the mammals we have today. That's the evolutionary atheistic explanation of how you got here. God created these creatures. And we find their bones all over the world. Well, what happened to them? Remember, God told Noah to build an ark. You take these animals all into the ark. Now, not all animals were in this category of dinosaur were as big as this. There were some that were big, and this big that God is describing here. But most of the dinosaur bones and such they find are about the size of cattle. They're not humongous. So some of these, probably even juvenile animals, were taken onto the ark. Then after the flood happened, these animals were not able to reproduce and to flourish like they could before the flood. Conditions on earth were very different before the flood than they are today. And so these animals, they survived a little while alongside of mankind and then eventually died out. Now that is completely different than the evolutionary way of thinking. But there's evidence to prove that. There's all kind of evidence that shows in artwork, in all kinds of wall drawings, pictographs, and such that show the humans and dinosaurs lived together. People of ancient times drew pictures of them. You don't hear a lot about that in the evolutionary books. That kind of information is kind of swept aside. But man and dinosaurs coexisted. Job would have lived about probably around the time of Abraham, and that would have not have been too awfully long after the flood. And so these creatures would have existed then. And what about all the scientific evidence that these bones are millions and millions of years old? First of all, their dating system is very biased towards evolution. They only use the type of dating system for these bones that give them vast ages. The other dating systems that only gives a few thousand years, they reject. They don't use those because it doesn't fit the theory of evolution. Plus, there's been evidence of dinosaurs, bones that have been found that still have soft tissue in the bones. There was also, just here recently, within a few years, a dinosaur that had been found that was mummified, that had been enveloped in a special condition sometime in the past, and it had soft tissue in it. That shows it hadn't been dead as long as the evolutionary scientists thought. And the evolutionary scientists are just baffled. They just cannot understand this. They can't figure it out. But those of us who believe in creation, we don't have any problem with that. Because we don't buy into the millions of years. We buy into the thousands of years. Said all that to say this. This is one of these examples of how the Bible shows forth every creature that He's made. Gives glory to God and shows God's wisdom and majesty. From the deer, the oxen, the wild donkey, the ostrich, the hawk, the eagle, and something as huge and majestic as the behemoth, whatever creature that is. Now, next week, Lord willing, we will go into Job 41, and perhaps we'll finish up the book of Job, 41 and 42, and looks like we might finish out the book next week, Lord willing.